You should, you,
Ooh, there we go.
you should be good to resident aliens, I assume are immigrants, because you were once in the land of Egypt, you were resident aliens there. So there's a text that would support our taking care of all the resident aliens in our country, even if it.
Right. So, welcome to Bible study, everyone. One of the things, thank you, Sue, for that, bringing that out, that's repeated. One of the things that I think is interesting in kind of looking at some of the legal code, and at some point I don't have my thoughts prepared for today, but I at some point want to talk about the difference between how we see laws and how they see laws, because I think we're a very litigious society, so we see it slightly differently. But one of the things is it is repetitious. I make no claim of otherwise. You're going to see similar things pop up again and again. And I think that's interesting in thinking what this text is focused on. Like what topic comes back again and again and again, because you can see that they're thinking about it and thinking about what our focus tends to be versus what their focus tends to seem to fixate on. But with that kind of introduction, I actually have an opening question for you all to consider before we jump into Exodus 22 specifically. Is thinking about our modern litigious society, what counts as evidence?
DNA, crimes.
Yeah. Okay, so DNA, great.
Documents.
Okay. What kind of documents?
Oh, I guess, especially legal documents. You know, there's a good example of that in the Free Press this morning, where the lawyer for the boy that shot up Oxford, the lawyer for the mother has discovered that her son told a psychiatrist that he never asked his parents for help and that he lied to his friends on emails about asking them and about getting shot by his dad every day with a BB gun. And that apparently was in the deposition of the psychiatrist. And it was only when the defense, you know, insisted on being able to review that was uncovered. The defense never mentioned it, of course.
Oh.
Okay.
Prosecution, I mean, never mentioned it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, they don't do written stuff at all. Then it has to do with probably, it doesn't say this, but it's what you saw or what somebody else saw. And it assumes that you'll tell the truth.
Yeah, so we do place like high value on eyewitness testimony. Yeah. Somewhat, yeah. I know, I see Clay keeps trying to jump in.
I watch a program called Cold Justice where they review cold cases, and more lately, the cell phone records, and where they can coordinate with the cell phone towers and show where someone is at a certain time, not just what might be said in texts or something like that, but location of where they are to try to make them aware that they're at the scene of a murder.
Gotcha.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, Mary Ellen, what were you gonna say?
Well, I'm going to go back to what you said about eyewitness testimony, because they have shown that three people will have four opinions what they saw, and that it really isn't reliable. But the cameras, like at an intersection, or video cameras on a building that took in the crime scene, you can't dispute that. And so, you know, video evidence or video documentation actually is more reliable than eyewitness testimony.
Right. Oh, 100%, which is I think why a lot of people have dash cams now in their cars. It's just because it is so much better, instead of saying like, oh, this car did this car did that. You have actual video that you can go through and see. What I meant more is that when you have someone saying like, I saw him, like there's a human level where we want to trust the eyewitness part of it, even though Mary Ellen, you are completely correct. We have found that our memory is very faulty and not at all accurate.
Plus the lie.
Yeah. So what does it take to consider someone guilty in our society? Like what has to happen for the guilty verdict?
That's
A
sure.
jury.
Mary Ellen, a jury? Okay. Sue, what did you say?
Me?
Yeah.
Jury.
Oh, you said a jury too. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, Larry?
Beyond a reasonable doubt.
Notably, though, this that is for criminal cases. Civil cases is not beyond a reasonable doubt. That one has a slightly lower bar. But we kind of want more than just he said, she said, right? Beyond a reasonable doubt often means like you need evidence of something, right? So I ask these questions because thinking about what the people in the ancient world would not have access to. Of the things that we listed, what are things that are just way beyond what they would be capable of?
Anything electronic.
Yeah, nothing electronic. Certainly no DNA.
No writing. And apparently they trusted people's testimony at the time.
So that's actually why I'm asking these questions, is we don't trust people by and large to tell the truth. But thinking about what does it mean in a world where there's no video cameras to show if your oxen fell in a hole or had a heart attack or your neighbor who hired the oxen beat it to death, how do you know who's at fault? Like, so a lot of this is trying to think through, how do you decide what's true, what's happened, who's at fault, who's responsible in a world where people are illiterate, by and large, and no fault of their own, writing just wasn't very common. And there's no cameras to prove anything. How do you prove something happened or didn't happen?
You have to rely on somebody telling the truth if they witnessed it. If they didn't, if nobody witnessed it, you got a problem.
So in that way, how does an oath or like a statement in front of God hit differently in a world where there is no other written way to verify or not verify something?
Oh.
Well, the text keeps saying that if there is a disagreement then, or a conflict of what has been said, that they are to be brought before the Lord. And then, but they don't say what happens then. I mean, how do they get the word as to who's right? You know?
So to explain that a little bit, there's like two ideas here. One is that it's talking actually about an oracle, which has a slightly more like mystical quality, where they may be seeking the divine in ways that we would maybe today consider drugs, whether it's hallucinogenic things. Like that was just very common in the ancient world. Take some opiates and see what God has to say about things.
Okay.
What was that?
I said or peyote, which is what the Native Americans used. Yeah,
Right.
Sorry.
Yeah, the other common one would be like marijuana would have been known at the time and used at the time, because that, I believe, originates in China and then goes through India and then has made it to the Middle East. It was very common. And so sometimes they had these things that they thought evoked the divine. The other thought, or it seems like some text, instead of said brought before the Lord, other text will say brought before the judge. So it does seem like there is a judge who's speaking on behalf of God. So it's either an oracle or a judge. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Or
Right.
it's a threat. I mean, in their history, they know the things that God can do. And so it could simply be a threat that nobody wants to try or test or whatever with that. You know, it's like in families where I'm going to tell your father, or, you know, wait till your father gets home kind of a thing. You know, could be that too.
Yeah, I mean, in a world where the divine is everywhere, where God causes earthquakes and storms, the thought of like, I'm going to bring you before the city council on, like, in front of God, there may be an actual fear of divine retribution if you are lying.
Yeah.
And so all of this chapter, I think, makes so much more sense if we can put ourselves in that, like, that kind of headspace where we think that there is a likelihood that you will be smote if you lie in this context. That's not to say that there weren't people who just flat out lied, but there's other kind of key, like, clues as to like what may be going on in some of these situations where they are trying to establish evidence. So let's walk through some of what's going on here. I'm going to read some of them. I'm going to stop if I have something to share. If you all want to talk about something, flag me down, because there's a lot of just like little bitty rules that are just smushed together here. So the first thing that it deals with is stealing oxen and sheep. And this is kind of setting up like the baseline. If an ox or sheep is stolen, it is slaughtered or sold, which means it no longer exists, then the thief will pay fivefold for it. So one is stolen, five will be returned, or the amount of five would be returned on their behalf. Or sheep, it is four sheep per sheep stolen. So what's the level? Does this feel like an equal level of recompense for this?
No, definitely not. I wondered about the line that follows, that if he can't make restitution, who gets sold? Is it the thief?
Yes.
Oh my
Sold into
goodness. So it gets worse. You know, they get paid. Stealing, it probably means he doesn't have a whole lot. So you have to come up with four. Of course he can't.
So the thing is, remember, or I see your hand, Clay. I don't want you to forget what we talked about last time. So if you are sold into like servitude, it is for 7 years. And so this is not like eternal bondage. If a thief is caught, he's to be sold. But theoretically, after 7 years, he would then be a free person again.
It's a long time.
Yeah. So 7 years of indentured servitude because you were too poor to afford paying the recompense. But Clay, did you have a thought?
Did they brand or identify their stock in some way, like ranchers did out west? Because verse 4 says, if the beast is found alive in his possession. Was there a way to identify them that you're aware?
I will say it this way, as to the best of my knowledge, every society that raises livestock has a way to identify them. There are various ways that you can do this, whether it is like notching the ears of the animal,
Notching the ear,
or branding. They would have done something. I don't know what it is, but they would have done something to identify the animal.
I just kind of figured that. Okay.
Yeah, Larry?
When I was on a trip, and I think this was in Morocco, we came upon 2 sheep herders who were grazing their sheep, and they were intermingled. The sheep were intermingled, and here, 2 sheep herders. There were about probably 50 to 100 sheep, so it was a large number. And somebody asked the shepherd, how do you know whose sheep is whose, He says, it's very easy. It's like this. And he just whistled really loud, and half of the sheep ran to him.
That's great.
Yeah. So sheep can be kind of dumb. They're not the smartest animals.
Right.
But what they have found is they can recognize voices. And I remember learning this because it deals with some of Jesus's parables about like him being the shepherd and the sheep know my voice. Sheep recognize the voice of the people who take care of them, or have like a signal, kind of like Larry says. I've seen I know cows, it's not necessarily vocal or like voices in the same way, but the yodeling, or there's the Scandinavian version that the cows know the like vocalizations that are specific to their people. So it kind of makes me think of the 90s movie Air Bud, where there's a scene at the end of the movie because it's like, whose dog is it? And like the original owner is calling to the dog and the little boy's calling to the dog, and it's like, who does the dog go to? So if there's ever a dispute, you can like, if the sheep comes to you when you call, you know it's your sheep. So that said, if any of these animals are stolen but found alive, they pay double. So it's a much heftier price if the thief is caught and the animal is already sold and gone. It does make me wonder, though, how they know that the thief stole their animal if there's no physical evidence, but we'll leave that one to the imagination. The next verse is interesting because it's not if something is stolen, but if a thief is caught in the process of breaking it. There's the difference between if the thief is killed versus if the thief is caught and beaten to death. There is no blood guilt unless it's after sunrise.
Yeah.
I was curious if you all had thoughts about this one.
I thought that was really interesting. You're supposed to be able to see, I guess. And
Yeah.
So the commentary added this that I thought was helpful. This may not actually be if you like catch a thief breaking in the daytime, because most thievery was happening at night under the cover of darkness. The assumption is if you catch the thief and you're like waiting for the town to come and the sun has risen and you're just so angry that you beat him to death after you've caught him, is the implication.
oh,
Because that means you are not doing it in self-defense, you are doing it out of anger.
Anger.
oh, okay.
So I was curious if we are thinking about like our laws, if we have anything kind of similar at all to like, how do we figure out if something was premeditated or in the heat of the moment? Yeah, Larry.
Look how many people get shot, because, he was breaking into my house, so I shot him. I mean, there's no, that's considered justifiable.
Yeah.
So that's interesting. A neighbor who has since died had a loaded rifle to defend himself in his house, and somebody tried to break into he had a trailer. I don't know whether he kept a horse in it or what, something in there, and somebody was trying to break into it, and he shot his rifle at them, and he got in a lot of trouble with the police. Apparently it wasn't considered his house. He wasn't threatened.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. So we have like similar things of like trying to decide, is this justifiable? Is this not? I think it's our Like we have stand your ground laws or castle. I forget what it's called. It's like castle. Like you should be able to defend yourself in your property. But it's
Yeah.
one of those that it's not considered okay if you then like pursue them down the street.
Yes, that's what,
Or we still have this logic of like, oh, he was shot in the back, because shot in the back of like assumes that the person is fleeing, and that's considered very shameful. So we still have some of these conventions of like, was this justifiable or was this out of rage and anger where you pursued it too far? All right, carrying on. Next one is about overgrazing. Don't let if someone's field is overgrazed, you're going to pay them the best of your vineyard or the best of your field. Pretty straightforward, or?
I don't know.
The thought is you have control of where your animals eat, so don't let your animals eat someone else's wheat field. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
Well, out west, the big argument between the cattle ranchers and the sheep ranchers were because the sheep grazed so low to the ground they were killing the pasture. And there was nothing when the cattle came to that pasture, there was nothing for them. There was no new growth. And so in this situation where you're talking about sheep and cattle, it could just very well be that people who own the sheep let them graze too long in an area, and they destroyed the pasture for the cattle when it was, their rotation around.
Right, because a lot of the grazing land was kind of held in common. It's not like today, I feel like we have much stronger ideas of property laws, but in this much more nomadic society, the grasslands were seen as for everyone's benefit. And so you have to make sure that you are not using more than your fair share. Like move the sheep around, don't get lazy, don't kill the common property.
Right.
So in a similar sense, the next verse talks about fire. And if fire breaks out and catches thorns so that stacks of grain are burned, the person who sets the fire is guilty. Now, this is partially, once again, a lot of this I needed some help on. The notes are saying that, still evidently used today, if there's a thorny area, the best way to get rid of the thorns is to burn it. So this is likely an intentional burn. Burning can also help regenerate grasslands, but burning can often be taken too far and then your resources are destroyed. So it's once again about negligence. Yeah, Mary Ellen?
In the commentary on this verse, it says thorns used to hedge a field, which are removed to this day by burning. To be grazed, it is a case of negligence. The thorns are used to edge a field.
Yeah, so sometimes like property lines are like you just let it grow. But it's standard practice. Fire is good for grassland, so you might be intentionally burning a space, but then you don't let the burn go too far.
Right.
All right, so the next one is once again back to theft. Theft and negligence combined. If someone gave you something for safekeeping and it gets stolen, whose fault is it? And so if the thief is caught, the thief pays. But if the thief is not caught, you have to decide whether the person the item was given to was the actual thief. So did the owner steal it, or was it or did the person holding the item steal it, or was it stolen from them? Whose fault is it? And this is when we get into the thought of what does it mean to have evidence? What does it mean to go before God? So what do you all think of this? I gave my neighbor a big sack of money because I was going out of town, and when I came back, they said it was gone, but I think this guy might not be trustworthy. How would we
Why-
decide guilt,
Why'd you give it to him for safekeeping then?
right? So do we think it's a good, I mean, in that like ancient worldview of like let's make an oath before God, do you think that that would work as a way like to verify whether or not your neighbor did you wrong, or if wrong was done to your neighbor and to you?
How did they do it? I mean, that's they don't just, they just say that's what they're going to do, but they don't say how they do it or how they decide what the decision is.
I mean, part of this might, or what I am imagining based on just the way that I know other proceedings happened, a lot of the things where there is oaths being taken or like people are testifying, the assumption is that you are going to the city gates, which is kind of where people congregate, and you're doing this publicly. So in a sense, there is a jury, if only because people lived very publicly and in the market. And so to do this, to make the oath, you're doing it in front of your neighbors. And I wonder if you have to win the common consensus. Like if you were going to make an oath in front of everybody, it needs to be convincing that like, I didn't do this. And so you have the court of public opinion, which, yeah, Clay?
So would the court of public opinion be what they're saying when you shall come near to God in 8? And then in 9, it just says, he whom God shall condemn will pay double. So that's what's confusing to me. How do you know who God has condemned?
So this is, yeah, Mary Ellen?
I'm wondering if your reputation factors in here, that if you're talking about making a case in front of the public, people are known, whether, they're shady characters or if they're always honest people. And, the genuine population would have a sense of your reputation, your standing in the community. And if you're going to take your case before God in front of all these people, I think your reputation would factor in here.
100%. I mean, this is an honor-bound society. Like we've already read that somewhat in Genesis and early Exodus. Honor is a big deal because honor is basically your reputation. So 100% your reputation's on the line. Going back,
I didn't really mean your reputation is on the line. I meant your reputation could determine the outcome.
Yes. Yeah, I'm sorry. Yeah, we're on the same page. Larry?
Yeah, again, the thing that still bothers me, they are so meticulous in describing every little detail up to the point with what they're going to do to decide. Then they don't say anything. And now, to me, the implication is there wasn't anything. It's the threat that there might be something bad happens that is the deterrent. Otherwise, why didn't they tell you what was going to happen? A thunderbolt would come down or something of that nature. It's just more the idea that if you don't behave, you're going to be in trouble.
So if you think back, so I'm kind of going back to Clay's question of like, how would this have worked? There's kind of 2 or 3 time periods that we can kind of think about for like, how would this actually play out? So thinking back a few chapters, we had Moses sitting and all the people coming forward and having these disputes, and Jethro saying, whoa, Moses, you can't hear all of these cases. Appoint people as judges over the people. And we saw that tiered system of like, this judge for this many people, this judge for this many people, and this judge for this many people. So there is a functioning court system for these issues. In a way, when they are like in their nomadic wandering in the desert way, they would likely have, or so they eventually, we're going to read about the tabernacle and how it's set up. So there's basically a fancy tent, which is going to work as city hall. And so there would be a process to go to there to talk about your complaints, because one of the things we know in history is that people are rotten to each other. There's always going to be issues. One of my favorite archaeological finds is they found a tablet that was one of those clay tablets that was just supposed to be like for note taking, and then you can like crunch it up once you're done and turn it back into clay, and then you write on it again. Except it was found in the remains of a burnt building, which means the clay tablet was then fired and turned to stone, so it lasted. And the tablet is just complaining about this one merchant's copper, because it's like, Phil has the worst copper in the city. It is mixed poorly. It doesn't do its job. And it's just complaints. It reads like a Yelp review. And we have it immortalized till time because it was caught in a building fire. And we see like it belongs in today's world. The grumpy language is identical to this, what you see in the comment section today. And I love it because humans will be human. And so these kinds of things, it's not like their society was somehow less filled with these grumpy customer complaints or disputes between neighbors. Humans will be humans. And so they needed some way to like deal with these things of, hey, I loaned my neighbor my oxen to plow his field and my oxen died. It's his fault. And the neighbor going, your oxen was old, man. Like it had a heart attack. It just died. And if you've ever been on Nextdoor, I'm sure you know these kinds of comments that happen in neighborhoods. So all that to say, these are the same kind of complaints they would have. So when they're wandering in the desert, there is the tents that they would go to the judges of the people, and the judges would make calls on behalf of God, basically. Yeah, Clay?
I'm just going to make a funny comment here. Just read Krista Braylon on Gaynor on her Facebook pages. What goes on in her trailer park.
Oh,
with her neighbors. That's just what you were just saying. Said, I just read something about that.
right.
Yeah, right. Humans will be humans.
Yeah.
You're right. So the other side of this, though, is what happens once the community gets set up in the Canaanite land, because all of a sudden the system has to change because they're not like a nomadic tent society. A lot of these issues would be brought forth in the temple. The temple was a place of worship, but it would also probably be a place of governance. So there'd be a place to like take your issues. And there would be kind of a central court. There would be people to actually make rulings. They would oversee like oaths, like, hey, I swear by my father's name that like I am selling you this land. Like everything had to be done publicly because there's no written records for a lot of this stuff. So when it's talking about like judges and oaths, just know that there is a public aspect of this because someone has to witness when an oath is being said. And this is actually a great time to switch to number 9, when there is a dispute of ownership. Once again, this happens all the time. We still bicker about property lines or whose thing is whose. What they're doing is they are coming to the court of public opinion, going forth and like describing whose why it's theirs or why it's the other person's. And basically it's, can you convince the crowd? And the crowd gets to decide who's telling the truth. And back to you, Mary Ellen, and your comment, your reputation had everything to do with this. So, which
And there is a consequence here. I'm sorry, Chris. There is a consequence here. Larry, you were talking about they wouldn't tell what, the God would do, but in this one, it's pay double. So if you're lying, the cost is double. So, you already know the consequence if you don't tell the truth.
Yeah. I mean, and there's this one really connects to one of the cases that is famous in King Solomon's reign of the two women coming forward saying that the child is theirs. And you can see who wins the court of, well, Solomon's opinion at least, but it's, when it comes to children, it's not like, or the price of a child is kind of weird to pay, but the thought is that if you are trying to claim something that's not your own, you get double, or you pay double. So the next big chunk is about not just if you give your neighbor an object for safekeeping, but an animal for safekeeping, or and what happens if the animal dies while in someone else's care. And once again, we have the oath that we've kind of been talking about, like if the person makes an oath in front of the court, in front of the people and in front of God, and is deemed acceptable, then they have no price to pay for it. But in this one, we do have a bit of evidence. If it is mangled by a wild beast, the evidence, like bring the mangled carcass. But you are not assumed responsible for the actions of wild animals.
It's so much time spent on, I mean, I don't know if this reflects that the how many occurrences there were or law breaking, but it seems like they spent, judging from all these rules and all the repetition, there must have been a lot of people were always taking somebody else's land or wife or something.
I mean, I'd be curious to see of sum total of how many laws we have on record.
Yeah. Yeah, we have a lot too. It's always a variation on, yeah.
I mean, one of the hard things is for them, the legal code and the religious code are not separated out. Like we have a separation of church and state, which means our religion, like religion tends to be teaching of morals, but like we don't pursue just like I don't judge court cases. I'm not trained to judge court cases because our court system's something separate. But here it's one of the same. So these are, because it's kind of seen of like, how are we going to set up a just society? What does justice look like? And if God's the arbiter of justice, how do we live together well?
You have to curb a lot of impulse to do the wrong thing, it seems, or thinking that other people are doing the wrong thing.
I would argue that that's the same way today. Like, once again, I don't think we are very different as humans. And the like brain teaser that I find fascinating that I saw someone put out is, do you return your shopping carts? Because everyone knows that returning the shopping cart to either the corrals or to the store is the morally correct thing to do. But there is no punishment if you don't return your shopping cart to the corrals or to the store. Like, there's no punishment for it. But everyone knows it's the right thing to do. But still, we see people don't do it. And so it's the question of, can we actually self-govern ourselves? Or are we just always that close to taking the easier option when it's more convenient?
You know, it's interesting, at places where there are lots of like at Myers, they have every other parking space is a place to put your shopping cart. There's a lot of returns. At Whole Foods, there's only 3, I think, for the whole parking lot. So people just put them in the old place.
Same
I
way
like Aldi that you can't get your quarter back unless you turn it back in.
Well, yeah, I know, that's a good idea, actually.
All right. So let's keep carrying on because I know we still have quite a bit of this to walk through. So we have some more animal injuries, but then we have some social and religious laws that all of a sudden turn in like the way that they're talking, and it sounds much more like 10 Commandments talk of thou shalt not.
Mhm.
So the first of these kind of more social laws, just to clarify a little bit of language, when it talks about virgin, it just means young woman. Like there's no hint at her sexuality. And so this is one where it's actually interesting because if a man and a young woman are caught together, it doesn't mean that, or this is not implying a forced sexual relationship. This is literally, if you find 2 young lovers together, have them get married. And there is the implication of if her dad's not happy about it, then, well, her dad doesn't have to. But like if you catch 2 teenagers together, he needs to pay the bride price and then they're married. Voila. So Mary Ellen.
Can also work against the young woman if she wants nothing to do with this man, but he happens to catch her and has relationships with her. She's, you know.
So I will say that the language here is slightly different than when in case the assumption here is actually not in a case of rape.
Okay.
That tends to have a different set of language around it. This one tends to be assumed to be a consensual relationship. If that, or the thing is, in the case that you're talking about, they often say the same thing, however, is pay the price and she is now your responsibility, which is less, it's not ideal. There are reasons around it, but for this one in particular, it is considered to be a consensual relationship. The fault is still put on the man for these kinds of relationships because it is like seduction, but the introduction of like seduce actually kind of means that there's more consent on either side.
Okay.
So,
And women were still considered property in those things too.
Yep. So the next one is very interesting, if only because of history, what history has done with this. Thou shalt not permit a witch to live is the King James.
But they're only women.
Oh yeah, male sorcery is fine. It's actually just women sorcerers.
Yeah. This is the first reference that I recall to witches. You know, was that something that they dealt with commonly in society at that time?
Oh, magic, the world is magical here. This is a place that very much believes in divination, and you can do certain things and like influence other outcomes. There is the thought of the evil eye, or people like your neighbors could put a curse on you. Like this is 100% a world that believes in that. The interesting context here is sorcery in some ways is seen as divine manipulation. And so what this is outlining is women manipulating God. Don't let women manipulate God. where the thing is, we do have witches in scripture. King Saul, when he is pursuing King David, at one point goes to a witch and she summons him from the dead, or summons someone from the dead, and they talk to the dead because of a female sorcerer. Like, that just happened.
Okay.
But the thought is that women shouldn't be the ones manipulating God. However, like male sorcerers or oracles, that's completely fine. It's not the magic that is the issue.
Yeah.
But
Although in history, I don't recall reference to very many male oracles. It always seems as if they are female, you know, Oracle of Delphi and so forth, you know.
right. Yeah. At any rate, this is the verse that is brought out in many of the witch trials in Europe and America. So it has, this one line has a lot of historical significance. Let's see. So carrying on a little bit, let's see. We have about 10 minutes left. All right, we can get through this. Verse 20 kind of clarifies some of the 10 commandments. Whoever sacrifices to any god other than the Lord shall be devoted to destruction.
Yeah.
What does that mean?
Yeah.
I am not sure. Yeah, Clay?
Mine says utterly destroyed. That's pretty
Right.
clear.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. So this is where we start to see the scripture kind of evoking not just Yahweh being like the God above all gods, but only God. This is starting to set up the framework for like, there's not many gods in the world. There is one God.
Right. Okay.
But then verse 21, to what Sue was saying in the beginning, this we've already heard before, especially when the people are like in the process of the Exodus. God is all the time reminding them of like I'm doing this for you, like you were aliens in the land. This will be a refrain throughout scripture. And so we hear it again, that you shall not wrong or oppress the resident alien, for you were aliens in the land of Egypt. Basically, don't do anything bad to the people around you, whether they are widows or orphans, because you were once those people. And if you oppress the people, then I will treat you the same as I treated Egypt. That God will hear the cry of the oppressed. God's wrath will burn, and God will kill you with a sword, and your wives will become widows, your children will become orphans. That's a pretty big threat there.
Yeah, why isn't anybody quoting that now? No. Well, of course, Trump wouldn't care, but Biden would.
So, I mean, it's actually one of the things I've brought up a few times of like the things that humans always struggle with. How do you deal with people who are not like you, that are in your territory, in your land? This seems to be a perpetual human problem that comes up again and again and again. They struggled with it then, we struggle with it now. And so here we get the guidance of listen, like treat people well, or there will be consequences, and very dire consequences.
Mhm.
So what do we see in history? What are some of the consequences of not treating people, whether they are like the lowliest of all people or people who don't match mainstream culture? What are some of the consequences that like areas that have struggled with this, what have they faced?
Nothing seems to happen. They get away with it.
Sometimes, not
Yeah,
other
but
times.
about slavery,
Mhm.
of course, that's forced. It's forced, being a forced alien.
See, I would argue that slavery hurt America.
Yeah.
But
I would
Slavery.
argue that slavery and the oppression of the African Americans hurt us as a whole and still does.
Yeah, and they had slaves then too, so that seemed just like part of their, if they didn't like what you were doing, they just sold you. It wasn't a good thing. So
Yeah, I think society continues to struggle with
Right.
the oppressions of the past, and largely because they persist today, and
Right.
we're still reluctant to do anything about it.
I mean, one that I find interesting in the context of this is thinking about both the Russian and the French revolutions. Like those are two situations where the poorest people were not being taken care of. And what happened?
Mhm,
Destruction by the sword.
mhm, mhm.
When things get bad enough, people stand up to it. I mean, there is the struggles that Germany faced after they did a lot of oppression and some very gruesome genocide. Germany struggled for a long time after that. It's not like they got off scot-free.
no,
Sometimes US doesn't have some of those, but I would say like our society is still struggling. And we are the worse for it, because of some of the things that of the oppression. I think some of the angstiness we have today and the disagreement is because there's a lot of people who are struggling. And it's like, how does it manifest? Yeah, Sue?
well, the immigration issue is really interesting because immigrants actually are good for the economy. You go through a period of having to integrate people, and it's very expensive. But in the long run, it's better for society. It's with more people to buy goods, and more people to do the work, and more people to have babies, and a more interesting culture. I mean, it's weird. But they treated the Irish and the Italians and everybody, Poles. I mean, they've all been treated badly in the beginning.
Yeah. But even if we looked even wider of not just our country, but what does it mean to treat people well across the world? It's interesting to me how many immigrants that want to be in our country for seeking safe haven because they come from South America, which is they're fleeing violence. And then you read about how many times the US has had military interventions that helped create the situation that they're experiencing now.
Yes. We will be making up for that.
Right. So it's how do we treat people well, not just the resident aliens in our land, but how do we treat people well across the board?
Yeah.
All right.
And the main determinant, unfortunately, is money and power.
Which leads us to the next one. Good segue here. If you lend money to people in the poor among you, you shall not act as a creditor. You're not allowed to charge interest.
Okay, this is the Jews that couldn't charge interest. Now that apparently was taken seriously by people who were Christian.
The assumption was that you could not charge interest to your own people. So Christians didn't charge interest to other Christians, and Jews did not charge interest to other Jews. But the Jewish people could charge interest for Christians, and Christians could charge interest for Jews. That's how that system gets set up.
I didn't know that Christians were allowed to charge interest with anybody. I only know this because of Merchant of Venice.
Oh. It's seen as don't charge your own people, basically. But the interesting one that I did not know, this is rang new to me this morning, is verse 26. If you take your neighbor's cloak as a pawn, you shall restore it before the sun goes down, for it may be your neighbor's only cloak. Evidently, they had pawn shops, which is kind of fascinating. But the notes in my Bible actually say that an Israelite letter from the 7th century BCE complains that a laborer's garment was seized for unsatisfactory work. So this does seem to we have somehow a letter that says that, yeah, this was an issue. But this one also has like a little bit of a threat at the end of it. If your neighbor cries out to me, I will listen, for I am compassionate. So this is also where we see that God, even though some of the punishments for these laws seem very grisly to us today, we already see God setting up on the side of the oppressed. Like, I will listen to the widows and the orphan. I will listen to the poor. I will listen to the laborers crying out. We see what side of the fence God seems to always be sitting on, and it's not on the side of money and power. All right, 4 more to go. You shall not revile God or curse the leader of your people. I guess that one slightly contradicts what I just said, but you shall not delay in making offerings of the fullness of your harvest and the overflow of your presence. The firstborn of your sons you shall give to me. You shall do the same with your oxen and with your sheep. 7 days it shall remain with the mother, and on the 8th day you shall give it to me. You shall be a people consecrated to me. Therefore you shall not eat any meat that is mangled by beast in the field. You shall throw it to the dogs.
Question.
Yeah.
When they say you dedicate your firstborn son, does that mean you sacrifice the son?
I did some reading on this because I had the same question, because by that it sounds like child sacrifice, doesn't it?
Yeah, but it doesn't. Nobody has ever commented on that, or
I was reading some interpretation of the rabbis, and there is a bunch of different explanations. The one that I think may be the closest is that this will be, or the assumption is that you will give your child to service in the temple, kind of like they will be a temple worker. The first child is to God, so it's like in like the Christian medieval sense of like give them to the church. It's kind of a similar thing of like kind of putting them in the same class of people as like the Levites. So because it doesn't seem to be talking about circumcision here, which was my knee jerk, like, because you would circumcise all of your males, but it does seem to be slightly unclear with what they mean in this.
Okay. Well, I think the Catholic version would be one of your sons, or would be the priest. One would have to go into
Yeah.
But that wasn't the rule of the church. It was usually the family wanted that, right? I don't know. It's only in novels anyway.
So I know we're at the hour, but what do you all think of this group of rules and laws? Is it just interesting history, or do you think there's any application for today?
They do. I mean, particularly the treating of the alien, resident alien, not the witch thing.
Right.
And how you establish truth is more difficult now. You know.
You think it's more difficult now?
More difficult now because it's a very complicated society. There's all sorts of ways you can hide information. I mean, you could, my mother's way of figuring out which one of us did it was the person who jumped up and down and denied it the most was probably did it. And it wasn't valid because my sister always jumped up and down and said she didn't do it, so she got blamed, and I just stayed cool. So,
Mhm.
you know, you don't, it doesn't always work.
Yeah.
How they do it in families, but
I mean, I think it's something we still struggle with today is like we see them struggling with like how do we establish truth, and we have sophisticated means to do it today, and yet
Oh.
we still struggle
Mhm.
because part of our struggle is just human bias. Like it's fascinating to me is seeing studies of beauty bias and how more attractive people get lighter sentences.
oh, they do. Okay.
Mm-hmm. So it's interesting trying to figure out how do we actually get at the truth of the matter. All right. Well, we are going to continue on next week with more guidelines and rules to live by.
I thought we were supposed to read 2 chapters at a time now because it's all blah, 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 and did I dream that?
There, look at the Northminster notes
notes,
is what I
yeah.
would say, because it's I was looking at it today, and it's not always going to be 2 chapters, but there's some specific ones that are I find particularly tedious to go through, and it mostly deals with setting up the tabernacle. And
Oh,
we get to
okay.
read about dimensions and cloth and stitching. It's kind of fascinating, but not, I can draw more out of this kind of text than I can of like describing the priestly garments. Like, I'm
You're-
gonna be honest, I don't have much. I don't know what else to say about that.
I hope we're not reading, oops.
Ah,
in
Larry,
fairness.
you printed it out.
All right, there are 2 weeks when we're doing 2 chapters, and that's November 28th and December 5th. There's
Okay.
only 1 chapter next week.
Okay,
Awesome.
okay, thank you.
All right.
Okay, thank you.
Well, shall I pray us out for today?
Yeah.
Yeah. All right, let us pray. Gracious and loving God, it's always interesting, God, to read about how people seek after truth and how we seek after justice. It seems to be in our world, we will perpetually struggle with what these words mean. For each person has their own perspective, their own take, their own story, and our own ways to identify, to understand how things happen in our world. Help us in our world as we are struggling with these things, find a common story to tell together. That even if the facts and the details we see differently, that we might be able to find a common story of truth and justice. May we find a common story that protects the weakest among us. A story that helps us seek after the justice that we read in your scripture. Help us do these things out of care and love for each other, for those who look like us and those who don't look like us, for those whose stories we understand and those whose stories are baffling to us. So guide us in our wisdom and in the ways we go through our lives, that you may be our constant guide and our ever-present wisdom. So we pray all these things in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.
All right. I'll see you all next week.
See you next week.
Oh, next week is Thanksgiving week, isn't it? Already?
I think we're still planning on doing it next week, though. I don't know.
Okay, I
Trust the
will be,
notes.
I'll be away.
Okay. Take care, everyone.
Okay, bye.